So welcome to day 2 of our final Ending Institutional Corruption Conference. I'm Larry Lessig, and I'm incredibly happy to welcome this panel here who comprise some of my favorites in each of the relative categories. So my favorite economist has got to be Paul, a man I've admired ever since I was a kid for his bravery and incredible insight and strength. Congressman, welcome back to Harvard. Kim has been one of our most prolific and successful of our fellows, and Mal has been persistent, actually attending almost every single one of the workshops over the course of these 5 years, and a dear friend. And I'm grateful that we have also a journalist who is an incredible financial investigative journalist, and I will turn it over to him to run the conference. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's opening session, Reshaping Economic Policy to End Institutional Corruption. What can I say? We aim high around here. My name is Gregg. I'm a financial journalist. I was a research fellow here from 2012 to 14, and my work focused on finance and economics. One of the ways knowledge was created at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics was through our weekly seminars and guest lectures, where very smart and informed people spoke to us. And then we thought about what they said. A second way that the center created knowledge was encouraging very smart and informed people to fight it out. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to listen, and we're also maybe going to fight it out. So I'm going to start by introducing our smart and informed panelists in alphabetical order. First off is Barney Frank, the former U.S. Congressman from across the river. If you want to know more about him, this is available at the Coop, his book. Kim Pernell-Gallagher is a PhD candidate in sociology, and her work focused on social and cultural norms as they affect economic oversight. Paul Romer is professor of economics at NYU, and he is also director of the Urbanization project at the Stern School. And finally, Malcolm Salter, Emeritus James J. Hill Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He was our faculty advisor, and I frankly bothered him shamelessly during my time here to help me with my work. But he always said yes. So if you want to know more about him, you can buy his book, Innovation Corrupted, about the Enron scandal. I also covered the Enron scandal, and my boss took me out for pizza. Mal got a best-selling book. There's no justice. I don't know what to tell you. Okay. The way we're going to do a format today is I'm going to ask each of the panelists one question, and they will get about 5 minutes to talk individually. Secondly, then, we will ask a broader question, and we will ask them to debate it among themselves. Questions are encouraged toward the end. I don't know how much time we're going to have, but we'll do what we can. I want to start with Malcolm. Malcolm, why does institutional corruption seem so prevalent in business and finance today? Take your time. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to make an audible call at the line of scrimmage and dump my slides, but we can get back to them if there's any interest in them. The answer to the question is, and I've been actually thinking about this for a long time, is I don't know. I came of age during the GE Westinghouse price fixing and the Kefauver hearings that dealt with, among things, with pharmaceutical pricing. So I've been thinking about this issue for a long period of time. So is corruption more prevalent today in business and finance than before? I don't know, but there's some possible answers to this question. One, maybe our expectations for acceptable conduct have simply changed over time. Or maybe we have simply become more proficient in revealing and reporting long-standing corrupt practices, like sexual assault. This has been going on for eons, and now it's being reported and analyzed and dealt with. maybe the rules and regulations of contemporary society, including both deregulation and new regulation, have actually had the perverse effect of promoting widespread corruption. Or maybe there's simply more money around to appropriate through rampant opportunism. I think probably all four are working, but there's one other massively important factor that I would like to put on the table for your consideration, and that is the curse of short-termism, and how short-termism is now either driving or inviting institutional corruption. So I've got to say two quick words about, again, what we mean about institutional corruption and what we mean about short-termism, then get to the relationships between the two, and then what do you do about it. So echoing what we had on yesterday, what I'm referring to in terms of institutional corruption is institutionally supported behavior. That's not individual rogue behavior. That, while not necessarily unlawful, erodes public trust in the offending firm, undermines its otherwise legitimate processes, and weakens its capacity to achieve espoused goals. So you will see that there are a couple of tests. There's a public test and there's a private test. So what are the common forms? What are the common forms of institutional corruption that are being driven by short-termism and other drivers? One is the gaming of society rules of the game. I'd like to talk about the Volcker Rule, if you'd like to talk about that afterwards. We've spent some time talking about it here. Second is tolerating conflicts of interest. Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, I'd like to talk about that. Persistently violating norms of fairness. I'd like to talk about that. We could talk about executive compensation, and we can talk about crony capitalism, which is everywhere. Okay, so the question then becomes, how does short-termism drive institutional corruption? Short-termism refers to excessive focus of executives and publicly traded companies, along with fund managers and their investors, on short-term results. And the basic hypothesis is that the shorter the time period of measurement, okay, and the larger the rewards that are linked to those measures, the greater the incentives for executives to game, to cheat, to pursue personal gains at the expense of their organization's goals. I can go through a whole range of details on that, but that's the basic hypothesis. What drives short-termism? Fascinating subject. There are many drivers. One is the rise of the new financial culture. I'd like to spend some time talking about it and what that is. It also, that just reinforces a general vulnerability to our hardwired behavioral biases that were pointed out originally by Adam Smith, Arthur Pigou, and has been proven by brain science today. So I can talk about that if we have an interest. So the final question is, okay, if the hypothesis is that short-termism actually is driving, is one of the important drivers of the kind of institutional corruption that we see, what do we do about it? And I'm going to end this with four things. Can do it in less than a minute. I can do it in less than a minute. There are four things that I'd like to put on the table for all of you to think about. They're kind of four levers. Think it like you're in a Caterpillar tractor. You know, you go like this. One is, you can ask yourself, and this is a question, is it more regulations and greater penalties, like the European Banking Authority? We can talk about that. Is it corporate governance reforms, i.e. fixing the perverse incentive problem? I'd love to talk about that. Is it corporate tax reform? Barney, this is one of my soapboxes. We can talk about that, and I'm sure you've got lots of views on that as well. Or do we talk about re-examining the curriculum in business schools and economic departments, so our students can have a really deep exploration of issues around the ethics of capitalism and profit seeking? So these are four things. These are four levers that we could pull. Maybe we pull all of them. I'm happy to discuss these particular remedies and everything that goes before it.
Thank you.
Am I okay? Did I come in under the wire?
You
Okay.
Exactly.
I didn't
perfect.
use the clock.
And I should tell you, I requested an orchestra so they could play like at the Oscars, but they turned me down. So anyway, it's not a fire drill. Okay. Next up, I'd like to go to Paul Romer. Paul, we have done a lot of research at the Ethics Center about the notion of capture, often regulatory capture. But I know that you also have done writing about the notion of capture of economics. So could you talk to me about your ideas regarding that concept and tell us why it might relate to the institutional corruption issues that we've talked about here?
Sure. Let me tell one story and then use a metaphor, and then I'll come back to your question. The story is that when I moved from California to New York, I saw people crossing against the walk signs in New York, and I had this visceral reaction that that's wrong. They shouldn't do that. I wanted to tell them, I said, stop that. You're supposed to pay attention to the signs, because in California, you actually pay attention to those signs. Fortunately, I had good sense not to do that, because I was kind of completely outside the norms in New York. And as I watched over about 3 months, that visceral reaction about what's right and what's wrong completely went away. It was like, oh yeah, well, of course they're walking. There's no cars, it's efficient. So that this process where our notion of what's right and what's wrong is influenced by the behavior of others is an incredibly important one. And I think sometimes it helps to step back a little bit. This is where economics can be helpful, is to step back from those kind of hot emotional reactions and say, okay, well, is it actually good to have rules where people can cross even when the stoplights say don't cross? Are the California rules better than New York rules? And then if you're going to have the New York rules, is it important to have the law conform to the norms? Is it okay to have them differ? So sometimes it helps to stop and to step back and think, but it is important to recognize that the law and the norms operate in parallel, and they together are what determine behavior. So often I think in changing a situation we're calling corrupt, I think we can say, look, the rules that everybody's following are not good rules, in the sense that you could change the rules, everybody could be better off. And then you have to think, okay, how are we going to change the rules and change the behavior if it's guided by both laws and norms? Okay, now here's the baseball analogy. And I don't know almost anything about baseball, so forgive me if I get this wrong. But the economists are going to be like the umpires. And there's the owners who decide how big the strike zone is. And imagine that there's a very small strike zone. So like almost every pitch going in is called a ball. And the umpires get together and say, hey, this is bad. Or a few kind of leading umpires say, this is really not a good thing. The game's boring. Let's just start kind of biasing things in favor of the pitchers. So you just start calling more things as strikes unilaterally. And this becomes the norm amongst the umpires. You just always call it a strike, always call it in favor of the pitcher. That might lead to an improvement in the game for a while, but at some point it gets boring again, because everything is called in favor of the pitchers. So the history of economics, starting from basically the post-World War II era, is that there were a small group of people at the University of Chicago, where I did most of my economics training. George Stigler and Milton Friedman were the key leaders, who saw something like, we're calling it way too much in favor of the government after the Great Depression. We got to start making sure we always call it for the market. And they, to a really astonishing degree, shifted not just the understanding of the facts about the economy, but even the norms that economists used in their discourse with each other, shifted everything in the direction of calling it in favor of the market. Now, they were successful partly because in the early stages they were probably moving things in the right direction. But I think there's a good case to be made that that this idea has gone too far, especially in financial regulation. But what's really troubling is that we've undermined basically the norms of science in economics to a degree that I think most economists are not aware of. They've become dogmatic and kind of set in this very rigid framework of a strong presumption that the market is always right, and any intervention, even the language, intervention has this connotation to it. So right now we've got a situation where I think economists are like umpires who always call it a strike no matter what. People who rely on economists need to know that. They need to pull back and be skeptical and look for other sources of advice. And within economics, I think we need to think about how do we escape from the norms that have evolved over the last 50, 60 years and move back to something like the norms of science instead of the norms of advocacy.
Thank you for that. And we will now turn to Kim, with whom I shared an office while I was here. And I do apologize for that rubble pile called my desk. And I'm sorry we failed the health inspection that time. But anyway, Kim, what do you think is the biggest problem with economic regulation in the U.S. in light of especially of what Mal and Paul have just told us? And how would you fix these problems in economic regulation in 5 minutes or less?
Great. So I think the usual answers to this question focus on things like regulatory capture or moral hazard or other kinds of misaligned incentives. But I'm going to bring focus to a different problem: the beliefs of the American banking regulators, which cause them to take their institutions down destructive paths. So I argue that we need to pay closer attention to the agendas of the people who design and implement regulation, not just what they're paid or, who they're dependent on. Otherwise, I think we're going to end up with regulation that either doesn't get to the root of the problem or, even worse, actually produces the opposite of what we would like. So to support this argument, let me give you the punchlines from 2 of my research projects. The first project, co-authored with Jiwook Jung and Frank Dobbin, looks at the unintended consequences of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, the legislative response to the accounting fraud at Enron and other corporate giants. This law increased the legal threat to bank executives, who responded by elevating risk managers to the new position of chief risk officer. We show that these chief risk officers entered their new positions with a pre-existing professional agenda to maximize shareholder value. And this caused the law to backfire. Instead of restraining risk, as Sarbanes-Oxley intended, chief risk officers pushed risk to the limits. The result? Banks with a chief risk officer developed significantly more exposure to the 3 riskiest types of derivatives in the years leading up to the credit crisis. So the second project looks at the development of banking regulation from the 19th century through the credit crisis in the US, Canada, and Spain, with the goal of trying to explain why the US ended up with such permissive banking regulation. I find that American policy choices only make sense after accounting for what American regulators really believe to be true about effective regulation. Specifically, their assumption that the market was a better regulator than actual regulators. American regulators tried to step back from interfering in the banking system because they thought that that would encourage the market to step back in. Canadian and Spanish banking regulators held different assumptions, and they developed different and better policies. So taken together, what does all of this mean? Well, it suggests that if policymakers hope to design regulation that works, they need to account for the professional agendas of the groups who take charge of regulation and compliance. So even if we succeed in breaking up the big banks, throwing financial executives in jail, and stopping this revolving door between the regulatory agencies and the industry, we're still going to have problems if the banking regulators themselves believe that their interventions cause more harm than good. Paying attention to professional agendas can also help us avoid regulatory mistakes. Chief risk officers have only become more popular in the banking industry since the crisis, in part because reforms have required banks to establish enterprise risk management programs, which are usually overseen by a chief risk officer. Putting risk management in the hands of professionals seeking to maximize returns is a strategy that's likely to backfire. All right, so beliefs and agendas matter for the outcomes of regulation. But how should we fix this problem? How should we go about changing the hearts and minds of risk managers and regulators who lead their institutions down destructive paths? We don't. The problem may be cultural, but the solutions can be structural. So in our paper on chief risk officers, we find that when CEOs and institutional investors had more of their own capital invested in a bank, they restrained chief risk officers from pushing risky derivatives. On the other hand, when CEOs relied on performance pay, like a big annual bonus, they were more likely to drag their banks into riskier activities. So for banks, changing compensation policies seems like a good place to start. And for the regulatory agencies, I'd start by taking a hard look at who we're currently hiring and promoting. We pay a lot of attention to industry backgrounds, but what about professional training? If we want regulators who actually regulate, we might reconsider the current practice of regulatory agencies recruiting almost exclusively from top economics graduate programs. A little bit of intellectual diversity could go a long way. Okay, but all of this is step 2. Before we can start to fix the problem, we first have to acknowledge that beliefs in the financial system, not just incentives and not just dependence, play a major role in creating the types of outcomes we're trying to prevent.
Done?
That's it.
Oh, wow, the timer didn't go off. Oh, okay. Thank you. And now we'd like to go to Congressman Frank. Do people still call you that? I don't know.
They shouldn't.
Okay, okay, all right. Then we won't.
Titles should die with the office.
At the center, we studied a lot about the concept of dependence corruption. In other words, two parties with interest, mutual interdependence that ultimately doesn't serve the public interest. What is your view of what we call dependence corruption between Wall Street and Washington? Does the common interest that they share ultimately serve the public interest?
Well, I would challenge the half of that premise, namely that there is a monolithic Washington. That has been true from time to time, but particularly since the crisis, it has not been true. There is a very real difference between the two parties. It's not as sharp as many people would like. In some ways, it's sharper, and I can take part of what said before. In a healthy society, you have a private sector and a public sector, and you have a political party that tends to be more interested in increasing the influence of the public sector and one in the private sector, and you fight over where you draw the line. What's happened in America recently is that there has been an increasing dominance of people who believe that the public sector has no value. The problem, I would say, is not simply that the regulators are inclined to think that the private sector is always right. It is that the political community includes a lot of people who think the public sector is always wrong. Now, there have been some regulators who went the other way. During the financial crisis, some of us were trying to pass legislation to restrict predatory loans. Until the crash, we were outvoted because the culture said they were wonderful. In 2007, when I first became chairman and the committee I chaired passed a bill to restrict predatory loans, the Wall Street Journal attacked me for interfering with the right of minority groups to own homes. Stalin never changed Russian history more effectively than the Wall Street Journal. I think they probably abolished that editorial from their files. And basically what happened was the right wing, people who've had imaginary friends, they have an imaginary enemy. They now think that they were against all these things that they were protecting against efforts to regulate. Brooksley Born was the head of the CFTC. She tried to regulate derivatives. So a lot of it does have to do with the culture, and let me talk specifically about how to do it. One, on regulatory capture, an institutional problem. A great journalist named Floyd Norris, who kind of acted like he was a character out of front page. He just retired from the New York Times. He was a great iconoclast. He documented the fact that United States senators now dominate the appointments to the regulatory agencies other than the chairmanship, so that you get these people who come from the political culture bringing their agendas and their friends. That's been a problem. Obviously, campaign finance reform is a problem, and it fits in this same situation. Ideally, we have a situation, a private market, where the more money you have, the more influence you have, and a public sector where it's one person, one vote. What this Supreme Court has done is take down that barrier so that the leverage of more money now carries over. So part of this will be electing a president who will appoint Supreme Court justices who will reverse the Citizens United. The other part, though, has to do with some of my friends on the left. Please stop telling people that it's so corrupt that voting doesn't help. Yes, money has much too much influence, but when the public does get engaged, it can help. There are, in Washington, it's as I said, not monolithic. There are supporters of a stronger regulatory and legitimate regulatory scheme, people who are skeptical of the market. The problem is that they have usually are outvoted. Only occasionally can they win, and we need to, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to tell people they never pay attention. Elizabeth Warren, when we passed the bill to create an independent Consumer Financial Protection Bureau over the objection of all of the financial community, said when the press asked her comment, they told me not even to try because the banks always win. But they didn't win today. But that was unusual because we'd had the crisis. Look at net neutrality. There was an overwhelming concentration of money against net neutrality. By the time the average citizen spoke out, you couldn't even find a member of Congress who had ever been against it. Now, it's hard. The norm is for these people to be more dominant. So I would urge, and then it also has to do with corporate governance. We do try to empower people. We have say on pay. I hope that the SEC will take the authority we gave them. I try to make it statutory to have proxy access so people can be challenging the corporations more. Unfortunately, that's a power that's rarely used, partly because the institutional investors have a big conflict of interest and don't want to challenge the people in power in the corporations at a time. So yes, I'd like to see campaign finance reform change. I'd like to see some change in the way we deal with these nominations, but equally important, people have to be encouraged to use their vote both within the corporate structure, but even more in the political structure. It will always be a hard thing to activate the average citizen. But without that, if you don't get the average citizen convinced that he or she can make a difference and they vote more frequently than they do and more thoughtfully, then nothing else is going to succeed, because there will always be people on the other side, and those who favor regulation, who favor a public role, are going to be outvoted all the time.
Okay. Thank you for that. And by the way, we had Bob Kaiser was one of our guest lecturers, Act of Congress, about the creation of the Dodd-Frank bill. I highly recommend that book. Much of my writing at the Safra Center went into an ebook that's available on Amazon for 99 cents, and I'm planning on living on the royalties for that for the rest of my life. All right, now we want to talk about the question. And here is mine, and it relates to what I think my colleague Bill English mentioned yesterday. Well, he's research director now. My superior, Bill English, said, the shrinking definition of corruption. I covered in my journalism career Michael Milken, and I covered the SNL crisis, and I covered Enron. I covered the accounting crises. Many people I covered went to prison. There was a sense that corruption and crime were intertwined. In the economic crisis, so far as I know, there were really no major criminal convictions. And yet I think there was a sense that something was institutionally corrupt. So I want to ask the panelists, can an institution be corrupt without corrupt people in them? Have we shrunk the definition of corruption to the point where if there is no offense, is there corruption? I'm going to start with Mal. Just because, okay.
Yeah, of course. And this is, I think, one of the innovations, of Larry and Dennis and his definition of what institutional corruption is. Because they're basically, look, I'm not interested in crime. I'm going to leave that to the DA. That's not my, what I'm interested in is lawful but corrupt behavior. And that's behavior which leads to diminution of trust in the institutions, whether it's Congress or whether it's a bank, and basically drives attention of the organization away from its intended purposes. Okay, so yes, so if you define corruption that way, it does exist outside of the realm of crime. So my short answer to that is for sure, and I think that's really the agenda of what we've been doing here, at the Safra Center. I can give you more examples of that.
All right, Paul.
I take it it's more fun if we disagree. So let me try. I don't think you can ignore the role of the law here. So let me use another example, picking up after your dog. By and large, better behavior is enforced in this area now by norms. You see somebody who doesn't pick up after the dog, you make them feel bad in some explicit way. So it looks like the law isn't doing anything there, but a change in the law may actually be critical to changing those norms, and occasional enforcement of the flagrant violators may be important to keep the norms from unwinding. And to see a kind of a more recent, more explicit change in this, think about smoking behavior, where the norms have radically shifted about who's got the right to either smoke or not be subjected to smoke. That change was induced by the law. I don't know if they've ever given a ticket for smoking in New York City in a place where you're not supposed to smoke. But the threat, if you're right, possibly, yeah. But the law, I think, still plays an important role here. And then the final example to keep in mind is when Giuliani actually talked about giving the jaywalking tickets for the behavior that the behavior that I saw, and it was going to produce like a firestorm of protest, and he immediately backed off. It was the one kind of broken windows thing where he realized he just couldn't go there. So it's a subtle process about how these two things interact, but I think we shouldn't neglect the deep role of the law.
Okay, so Barney, you wrote a law, Dodd-Frank. What did you think?
That there will be more criminal prosecutions going forward. 3 points. First, unfortunately, some of what was outrageous was not illegal. That was part of the problem. There were things that they could do that they shouldn't be able to do. There have been a couple of subsequent prosecutions. We have made some things illegal that weren't. For example, giving people mortgages when there was no earthly chance that they can pay them off because you're going to sell the mortgage. You don't have to worry if they don't pay it back. We have made a lot of that illegal. Secondly, though, there was a problem because not only was there ambiguity on the law, and certainly as liberals, we don't want to forget about the notion of due process, that you should not be criminally prosecuted unless you could have been reasonably sure, if well-informed, that something was criminal, and there was too much ambiguity there. Secondly, though, and it goes to Kim's point, the institutions managed to layer things so that there was not the kind of culpability at the top that you could prove. People have complained that only lower-level people have been convicted, and there have been some, but that's because they very cleverly worked things out. Now, there is the, Sarbanes-Oxley tried to breach that, so it could have unintended consequences. Third, but there clearly, it certainly is the case, it depends on how you define corruption, but violation of the law, no, an institution cannot violate the law without individuals doing it. I know the Supreme Court said corporations are people, but people at least coexist with them. They didn't abolish people when it comes to responsibility. So there should have been some more prosecutions. I think the problem was in part the fear, and it came from the accounting prosecution when they put a company out of business. There was this fear, and in fact, I think from the economic stability standpoint, it is better to prosecute individuals than the institutions, because you then don't run into this problem of losing out a competitive aspect. But I think it has to be partly the Washington culture, and my hypothesis is this, maybe you guys can check it out. There have been serious prosecutions of financial misdeeds. They have been overwhelmingly U.S. attorneys prosecuting insider trading. Now, that's something that has been done at the U.S. attorney level. Very little has been done at the national level. My inference is that there was maybe implicitly an inhibition of the national law enforcement people against going after people criminally because they were worried about the stability factor. The U.S. attorneys, in fact, the courts have now said that Barara went too far and was sort of making up crimes. But yes, going forward, the law has been more specific about things that should be illegal, and I did disagree constantly with the Obama administration. I believe they should have worked very hard to do some higher level prosecutions. When a bank is found guilty of lying about what interest rates were for LIBOR, when they are manipulating, you go and you make as your goal to prosecute the highest possible person of whom you can prove there was knowledge.
But Kim, could I ask you, because a lot of your work was international, the linkage between corruption and crime, or in this case, the disconnect between corruption and crime, is that a cultural norm? What do we see in other countries versus, say, the U.S.?
I think I'm going to go back to your previous question and the one you just asked and wrap them both together. So I think with increasing the legal penalties for fraud, for wrongdoing, leading up, things that happened during the crisis, right? So I think we really need to think about what we're trying to accomplish by increasing the legal penalties to executives who are, doing bad things in financial markets. So like with the chief risk officer paper, what we find is that this strategy ended up backfiring. CEOs responded, executives responded by getting nervous and, hiving off this function, giving it to the chief risk officers instead of actually taking ownership over controlling risk. So I think we need to think about what we want and whether increasing legal penalties is actually going to give it to us. And so to the international side of things, the US right now has like one of the strictest legal penalty regimes for corporate malfeasance in an international perspective. And yet we're still seeing all of these, corporate crisis, corporate fraud, one after another. And so I don't know, I really think it's time to reconsider whether making things harsher, throwing people in jail is actually accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish.
Paul?
Let me just pick up on this last point and
was racing
something
his hand.
Barney said. If you make the punishment too severe, the probability that you're going to enforce it goes down. It's not just that it's hard to catch people and convict them, but the more severe the punishment, the longer it takes and the lower probability you'll actually enforce it. So in your comment about maybe we should go after individuals instead of institutions, the punishment, if you convict an institution, is just too high. So I agree we should go after the individuals, and we should think about much less severe punishments. So we do this faster and with higher probability. To give you an idea of the order of magnitude, in a probation program, if you test positive for drugs, the usual recourse is you then go serve your sentence, which is say about 4 years. So you can get sentenced to essentially 4 years in prison for testing positive for drugs. There was a judge in Hawaii who said, well, forget that. If you test positive for drugs, I'm going to make you spend the weekend in jail. So the weekend versus 4 years. The number of people that they actually sent to jail went up dramatically, and the number of people who tested positive for drugs actually went down dramatically. So very small punishments regularly applied and quickly. If you test positive on Tuesday, you're in jail on the weekend. Small punishments regularly applied can actually have a very big deterrent effect.
I want to agree with Paul in principle, obviously, and I'm not imputing this to him, but I don't think anybody ought to be in jail for taking drugs, so I don't want him to go in or out or back, but the principle holds, and that's what I was going to say to Kim. We're not talking about increasing the severity, we're increasing the frequency with which it is invoked, and that's particularly the case, frankly, the shaming thing. You convict some CEO or some high-ranking official, you give them an hour in jail, and you have inflicted great punishment. I wouldn't just do an hour. But I do think that the criminal sanction would have a major impact in trying to deter this. And maybe we need to look. They are going to be clever, and you have studied this with the risk people. And I need, obviously, this is something the law schools can do. Is there some way? We have sort of an absolute liability in negligence. Is there something you can do to make the heads of the institution almost presumptively guilty in the case of a widespread fraud without tying them personally to it?
Mal?
I think this is really interesting, but I think it misses the point. We're not talking about crime, and we're not talking about criminal sanction when we talk about institutional corruption and what to do about it. We're talking about what Barney is calling outrageous but legal behavior. That's the really interesting one as far as I'm concerned. So that, for example, let me give you a case of this, okay? So you got Brian Stoller, who's a former student from the Harvard Business School, working as head of the CDO desk at Citigroup, okay? He creates a CDO fund and distributes it, sells it, and every investor loses every penny, okay? He gets $1 million bonus, and his supervisors, also get it as well. Rather than folding, when he's brought to court by the U.S. district attorney on this, he fights it. And he wins. Okay, he wins. Okay. I write a paper which is distributed by the Sanford Center, and to show that these papers are read, like a nanosecond after the paper was published, I get a call from Brian Stoller saying, "What are you talking about? How can you say it's corrupt?" Okay, and he says, "I won. I'm the only one who contested, and I'm the only one that won." And the reason why was because there was a disclosure, of the conflict of interest in a footnote, which if I gave it to anybody here in the room, no one would understand what that footnote said. Okay, so now the question is, what do you do about that situation where there's no crime and there's no criminal sanction, but there is a lot of social injury involved?
Right. First of all, we did try to make some of that illegal, and we also tried to change the compensation system. The SEC hasn't moved on that, but that is, we don't want one-way bonuses. The SEC is supposed to, with every financial institution, say that if you can get a bonus because it works, you got to get a clawback, and you lose money if it doesn't. Right now, it's heads they win, tails they bet.
And now we're talking about the real world.
Yeah, but
But
here's the second issue.
At Harvard? No.
But there is an important issue here, Malcolm. Lying about interest rates for LIBOR is a crime. That's not, so there were, I was talking about real crimes. Yes, there were some things that weren't illegal and should be or should be dealt with, but there were, with regard to foreign currency, with regard to reporting interest rates for LIBOR, with falsifying the mortgage applications of people who were too poor to get mortgages, there were very substantial crimes. I don't know why Angelo Mazzillo, I would have thought they could have made a case against him at Countrywide. He was presiding over an institution that was so thoroughly corrupt, it'd be hard for me to see how he wasn't there. But things like LIBOR, you're right about much of it, and much of it that's the worst on its impact. But there were also absolute
I agree with that.
crimes.
Yes, totally agree with that. And the only point that I would make is that just in my work on Enron, where they ended up with Skilling and Lay getting indicted on 19 counts. Okay, you had 33 executives who basically negotiated, their skin. Many of them went to jail. That wasn't the most interesting part of the Enron story. It was all the legal stuff that they were doing that was corrupt over a period of time. So the 19, and that's the stuff to really look at, and that's the stuff that is really at the core of a lot of the corruption that I'm interested in.
To me, the most interesting part of the Enron story was to put some of this money off their books. They had to find a guy that they put in charge of it who had no legal relationship to anybody in Enron and whom they can trust. So the boyfriend of one of the guys there, because they didn't have legal marriage, the guy who was a live-in partner of one of the high executives,
Right.
he was in charge of that fund, and that was legal.
That's lawful but corrupt.
Supreme Court will fix that.
But, okay, Kim, I'm going to put you on the spot. These institutions did pay huge fines. They did pay huge penalties. Isn't that a finding of corruption? In other words, I still am trying to figure out how the legal but corrupt concept, and John Reed, when he talked to us, said, I don't think it was a crime problem, it was a corruption problem. I'm still trying to say, how can an institution be corrupt and people are acting perfectly legally and properly within the institution, and that's not institutional corruption? It's not personal corruption?
I mean, this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse because I'm not a legal scholar, but I'll just give you my reflection on what you're saying. I just think it's important to think about, so like Mal cited the Enron case. So a year before Enron collapsed, Fortune magazine identifies it as the most innovative company in America. And leading up to
they were in a way.
And leading up to the financial crisis, I think most people were pretty happy with the trend, the way the stock market was going. Things were good. Things were good when you looked around. And when things collapsed, in hindsight, we start looking back at the same policies and the same practices, but we see what they caused, and then we, attribute corruption to them. And clearly things are broken, I mean, the Great Recession showed us that. There are things that are wrong. But I do think that focusing on fraud or not fraud, when is it illegal, when is it not, isn't, like Malcolm, I guess I'd say, is not the most productive direction.
Kim has made a central point. When everybody's making money, nobody
cares.
Nobody listens to your complaints.
But Paul, can I ask you, I think that it's out of my wheelhouse too, so I relied, prior to the crisis, on what the economists were telling us, what the field of economics was telling us, and they were saying the paradigm has shifted. This is a new world, and it's a safer world.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to look for advice more broadly than just economists. I think it's just too predictable what answer you're going to get back. And this relates to what Barney was saying about if you have these two parties, one kind of pushing for the state, one pushing for the market. One of the problems is we don't have good intellectual or practical support for people pushing on the state side. And it also, I think, is a problem for Kim when she says we should hire more people. Yeah, but who? Where are you going to get people who don't, have this kind of deeply ingrained set of presumptions? Because
Economic sociologists, yeah.
Maybe. The lawyers are
journalists. I'm just suggesting.
Yeah, but let me just give you one suggestion. If I were going to staff up a financial regulatory agency right now, I would go hire people from the FAA. And the reason is that you want some people who have experience, and here I'm going to agree with Malcolm. There's a lot of behavior you got to stop it that doesn't involve a violation of criminal law. So you want some regulators who can just have a phone number in speed dial, and you call somebody up and say, stop what you're doing, or I'm going to put you out of business. And I think within the FAA, they're used to doing that. They have accountability mechanisms to make sure that that doesn't get abused. But that kind of discretion at the level of a regulator is going to be important for dealing with some of this behavior.
I agree, but I'm somewhat hopeful. There is a shift in the economics profession. Paul Krugman is an example of that. Paul is today an articulate, regular commentator, bringing things home. He has moved away, and he acknowledges this, because there's Joe Stiglitz, but there's more. Two issues where the economics profession 30 years ago was kind of monolithically on the free market side, where there's been a real shift. International trade and its domestic implications and the distributional impact internally, and the minimum wage. There was an economic consensus that the minimum wage was going to hurt people. So, I mean, I agree that that's there. Part of what happened is that the crash of the that began in 2008 was hard for them to ignore. And I am somewhat hopeful that there is that change going on.
Malcolm, I want to ask you because...
Sorry, let me just keep this is because I think this is a good thread.
Okay.
I mean, it's true there's movement, and I think there's reason to hope that people working inside the profession can shift things. But if you think about this issue of the details of regulation, I don't think you could get some economists or some lawyers to back a solution that involves giving discretion to regulators.
Well,
They would tell you about due process and rights and presumptions, but none of them would design a system of regulation like what works perfectly well at the FAA.
I think it's generational, though. Look, we know there's people who were born under Reagan are more likely to vote Republican, than people who were born under Nixon. Everybody is somewhat shaped, and I think that my optimism is that the generation going forward, going to school, it's going to be harder to tell them that you always listen to the market when they're studying that stuff. Look, one example is the change in the reputation of Alan Greenspan, who was a god 20 years ago, and today is kind of an embarrassment. He's a wonderful man
so much.
personally, but some of his stuff, he's been very much discredited, and I'm optimistic that this can be changed going forward.
All right.
One other thing, another place you could hire people that Kim alluded to is Canadian financial regulators.
Right. Okay.
They're very familiar. They're very familiar with this FAA style regulation in finance.
And
just one anecdote.
All right. I want to give Malcolm a second here.
Yeah.
Incentivization, though, you've worked with a lot of CEOs. How do you actually change behavior? And you have about 30 seconds. I
mean, I can't be part of this conversation that we've just had because it's very interesting in terms of...
Sure. Go ahead. Sure. Go ahead.
On that. Holding aside the dependencies of the regulatory institutions that we've talked about yesterday, for example, and addressing the question of credentials, or who should be there, I just want to make a pitch for people who have just a sense of the jugular, and just kind of like smart people independent of what their training is. For example, a good friend of mine who won the Lenin Prize in medicine is not a doctor. He's a plastics engineer. He just got it, okay? And there are people, who have only a minimal level of understanding, of financial economics and accounting, who get it. Let me give you a case in point. Before the Enron crisis at the Harvard Business School, we had 5 cases on Enron. They were all operatic. I mean, they were operatic cases. So I decided, well, we'll take a look at it. This great company. Okay, so I went and looked through. And I'm not I'm sort of like the best third-rate financial economist in Cambridge. Okay, so I'm kind of going through the annual report, and I'm showing this wonderful these wonderful profitabilities, and I ask a simple question: where's the cash? There's no cash. There's no cash. So I go to my friends in accounting. I said, "Isn't this interesting? A lot of profitability. There's no cash." So all I'm saying is that we can talk about credentials, but it's still at some point it has to be who's got this practical sense of kind of what's going on. And I was helped. Now, what was the question you asked me?
Are incentivizations in alignment to create what we might term responsible behavior at the top.
No, and I think Barney started us down that track. I think it's absolutely right. There are people now out there, including one of our own, Richard Painter. There is Bill Dudley of the Fed. There is the Bank of England. There's the Bundesbank. All of these people beginning to look at performance bonds and covenant, kind of banking. I think this is absolutely right. If you don't have CEOs with skin in the game, if you don't have, which is your holding periods on options, if you've got naked options which are not indexed, you can go on and on and on this type of thing. You will get the kind of short-termism that I talked about, at the beginning. The issue is we know what to do. We know what to do. We're just not doing it. And the question is why? Is it a collective action problem?
I just want to follow up. Part of the problem is, and again, these are debates, and one of the reasons I'm looking for economists is I want to shift the political climate because it has been a fight, and I'd like those who are pro-regulation to have more support. But I also want to add on the incentive, one thing that's an institutional incentive, the most powerful, and it's the one area of the implementation of the law where the regulators have disappointed me. I think risk retention is by far the best thing to do. That is, it used to be that if you lent somebody money and they had to pay you back, you were careful. Then they got into you sold the loans, you securitized them. The biggest single piece of our legislation that I cared about was saying if you sell loans to other people, you take the first 5% of the risk. That puts the market back in there. It got diluted by the regulators, but that's the best incentive I can think of. You can take whatever risk you want as long as you're going to have to suffer the first 5% of the loss.
All right, I'm going to break in and move us in just a slightly different direction. The 5th anniversary of Dodd-Frank is in about a month, right? June 21st, is that when it was?
Signed in July, I think.
July, okay.
July 10th.
So,
July
okay,
10th.
so 5 years. And the U.S. economy is recovering. But what I'm going to ask all of you is, have we seen true new forms of economic thinking, as Paul might say, regulatory reform as envisioned by Dodd-Frank, changes of management styles or incentivizations that Kim and Mal have studied? So have we actually improved the notion of institutional corruption? The economy is recovering, but there's a little bit of me that says maybe we're just being lucky right now and things will change. So I want to start with you, Paul. And what about economic thinking post-crisis?
I think one way to frame your question is, are we going to have another financial crisis? And I think the odds are very high that we will. And I think you can think of this as a kind of a sawtooth process where, by the way, you can see there was a lot of variation across the states in the U.S. in the most recent crisis. The places that had the worst S&L crisis actually didn't do so bad in the most recent crisis. So you get a bad crisis, you get an institutional response, that erodes over time, and eventually you're going to get another crisis. So I think this is just the dynamic we're stuck with. I don't think we've seen as deep a set of changes in, say, the intellectual support for better regulation, more cross-national comparisons about what really works in regulation. And then finally on incentives, a senior civil servant in Singapore can make $1 to $2 million a year US. Wow. And so, with that kind of compensation, you can actually get somebody with a sense of the juggler and who's got some real opportunities to pursue a lifetime career in government. So if we want to get some kind of balance in the system, it would be better if we had compensation which didn't rely so much on the revolving door.
All right, Barney, 5 years on, what is the state of Dodd-Frank?
Well, I want to begin by agreeing with Paul on the compensation. In fact, it's causing an institutional bias because the Fed, being outside the regular civil service, can pay more. And one of the arguments that's leading to people to give more authority to the Fed than they might ideally want is that it can hire and has a better set of people. Secondly, I think it's in pretty good shape. Yeah, there may be probably another crisis. That's the nature of the system. It will not have the same causes, or at least we've dealt with that. First of all, the biggest single cause of the last crisis were loans being made to people who should not have gotten the loans. They were victimized. Those then were sent throughout the system. Those loans can't be made anymore. They have been made illegal, and I think that's very helpful. AIG came to us, and they were $170 billion in debt that they couldn't pay off. And they can't do that anymore. You cannot get that indebted with derivatives without having the money behind you. I did regret the watering down of the risk retention. It was not permanent. They temporarily set it at effective zero for residential mortgages, not incidentally for commercial paper, commercial loans. I believe that would be very helpful. In terms of impact, GE selling off its financial institution was a good sign that things are working. They are better capitalized now. They're making fewer bad loans. That doesn't guarantee that we go in the future. But the other thing, though, and there has been this change in terms of support. What's important in the near term is not just the intellectual, but the public thing. The media has become very pro-regulation. They used to be anti. That's a very big difference. Today, Elizabeth Warren is the single most influential public figure on regulation. She's for even more regulation than we have, and that's because she's strongly supported by the media. Now, how long that lasts, I don't know. But
And
I am
she's here on Monday,
optimistic
by
now.
the way. She's here on Monday. She's here on Monday this way.
Well, I don't think she'll lose any influence. No, I think the fact is, obviously the intellectual climate is important, but the media has now shifted. And somebody might even want to study the change in media reporting and the biases there in terms of reporting. The Wall Street Journal, of course, is an exception, but in general, the media has become critical that there's too little regulation. They'll never say anything was right, but they now, instead of criticizing too much regulation, say there's too little.
All right, but Mal, your body language betrayed you when I said, is there going to be another financial crisis? Paul said likely, and you were nodding in agreement, I believe.
Well, this is really kind of a question. The question is, I think yes, and the question is where it's going to take place. My sense it's going to take place in London, and the reason why it's going to take place in London is because under the Dodd-Frank heavily lobbied exemption, money-centered banks, and particularly in the U.S., can trade derivatives as long as by subsidiaries and as long as the securities are held in foreign bodies. And I just kind of looked this up again in the SEC review of this, and so there's a possibility of this happening there. I also am concerned. The other thing that I would add to that is the risk retention. I think that the risk retention is not there. It's absolutely critical to this, and I also think that there are other perverse incentives that exist in finance, and because of the collective action problem, banks don't want to really take the action that they should on that. One bank has, both in Europe and the United States. It was Morgan Stanley. They tried it for a year, both in England and the United States, and backed off, mainly because of people defecting, to other firms. You can say that with concentration in the industries, there's less places to defect to. But anyway, those are the three reasons.
Malcolm,
why
a question. When you say the foreign, is that in foreign exchange? Because
no, not in foreign. No.
Right,
It's
the overseas branches of an American institution are covered by CFTC regulation.
Yeah.
I mean, Jamie Dimon fought that and lost, so that the London Whale situation, the foreign subsidiaries of American banks are regulated by the American regulators in derivatives.
Kim?
I'll just jump in.
Ben?
So I don't think we're going to have a crisis that has the exact same causes either, but I do think that the next cause of the next crisis is still going to be inadequate regulation, because American regulation is still so focused on trying to prevent moral hazard. Like, that's the number one focus of what we're trying to do. So stuff like trying to get rid of too big to fail, trying to keep like problems from a failure at one bank from bleeding over and affecting other banks within the economy. But what about preventing bank failures to begin with? I mean, I think the American approach to regulation here is pretty weird in international perspective. Like, in other countries, the presumption is banks shouldn't be failing to begin with. Let's take some steps to try to prevent that. And like, I'm being a little inflammatory here. Clearly, our regulation has tried to prevent failures, but focusing on higher capital rather than focusing on ring fencing banks.
You're not being inflammatory, you're being inaccurate. American regulation is tougher than the European regulation in many ways. I mean, in fact, we spend as much time in trying to prevent this. Capital is very high. In fact, the current controversy going on, and it's interesting, I talked to the New York Times yesterday, and that's what I'm reporting about their pro-regulation. The finance community is claiming that we have gotten so tough that we have lost liquidity in the bond market, and there was a brief crisis about that. And blaming the Volcker Rule and blaming regulation. I was talking to people at the Fed about it. No, it is, in fact, America took the lead in a lot of these regulations. We fought through a rule that says that we will regulate, America will regulate the derivative activities of the overseas, i.e. London, branches of American banks, because we don't think they do a good enough job. So I would disagree that, I don't know who you'd be looking to as having tougher regulation, but it's not England and it's not the European Union.
All right, I'm going to add just, by the way, we're running a little close, so if you're planning on asking a question, we have mics, and you should get in line because we're going to finish on time. Go ahead, Kim, I'm sorry.
Maybe we can talk about this offline. Yeah,
Oh.
I want to give other people a chance to ask questions.
Okay, but I wanted to ask real quickly, because all of you have mentioned the role of regulation. And of course, we know the CFTC almost doesn't exist. It's just a very, very small organization. The SEC is obviously undermanned, understaffed, underfunded. Is that a form of institutional corruption when you don't fund the oversight institutions?
No, it's my point. It's an example of partisan difference over regulation. What happened was we gave great new power to the CFTC and some to the SEC over financial derivatives, which had been previously unregulated, and the Republicans took over the House of Representatives and unfunded them.
Right.
The point is the bank regulators don't have that problem because they're all self-funded, the Federal Reserve, the OCC, and the FDIC. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission depend on annual appropriations, and the Republicans have consciously and deliberately underfunded them. So yeah, it's an example of institutional corruption, but with a direct partisan cause.
All right, so we are going to move to the floor now. I will make I will tell you what I used to tell my students when I was still professoring. A question is a sentence that takes less than 45 seconds and is expressed as an interrogative. Okay. That said, my boss, Larry, is up there.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a different interpretation of a question. So no longer Congressman Frank. You've given us your legal opinion that there was not crime to punish here. Judge Rakoff gave us his legal opinion that there was plenty of crime to punish here. And he pointed to this radical difference in the prosecutorial behavior between the savings and loan crisis and this crisis. Now, when you try to understand why there was that massive difference, he has some particulars which I think are very good. For example, the desire to punish corporations is actually something that U.S. attorneys like to do because it's easier to get a victory quicker rather than prosecuting individuals, which is probably going to be more effective in changing incentives. But I wonder about the elephant in the room. Everybody talks about Citizens United as creating this big problem, but of course, the day before Citizens United was decided, it wasn't like we had a great democracy for the influence of money in politics. Can you really explain the failure to step up without looking at the fact that the largest contributors to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in congressional elections was exactly the industry that you had to have taken on in a really aggressive way if you were going to actually prosecute?
Well, apparently not to you, Larry, because you just you just misstated what I said. I didn't say there were no crimes. I talked about Libor as a crime. I differentiated. I did say, you look like you want to say something. Go ahead.
No, I will correct you after you finish this.
No, correct. I never said that there were no. You started out by saying I said there were no.
There's
What?
a camera.
I didn't say there were no crimes to punish. I talked.
Great, so then there was plenty of crime to punish. So why didn't they?
I know. No, you want to. I don't want you to back away from. Frankly, what disappoints you that you would distort what I said so badly. I said. Part of the problem was that there were things that were wrong that weren't crimes. I also said very explicitly there were crimes. The misreporting to Libor was a crime. I mentioned Angelo Mazzillo giving loans to people. I mean, I don't understand literally how you could have heard only what you wanted to hear. The fact is that I did say that some of the, and then the other part of the problem was that some of the CEOs insulated themselves because it was harder to get them. Having said that, I also said that I was disappointed there weren't more criminal prosecutions. I think it was partly cultural, as I said. The U.S. attorneys were more vigorous than the people at the national level. I think that's because they were not as inhibited by some sense of economic instability. As far as contributions are concerned, by the way, it is true that in 2008, the financial community contributed heavily to both parties. By 2012, that was no longer true.
That's right.
The financial community is now overwhelmingly giving only to Republicans.
Right.
When I ran for re-election in 2010, my opponent walked onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and was cheered. So the fact is that the financial community does not consider that they got their money's worth from us. But yes, I do agree that among the factors was some inhibition at the national level afraid of charging institutions and their chief executives because of instability. But I also said there were crimes committed. I was sorry that more weren't prosecuted.
Right, because of instability, but isn't it also, don't you also believe that it's because you don't want to increase the enemy that the
No,
Democratic Party has
the fact is, again, the Democrats alienated those people who gave us money. The fact is that, including the U.S. attorney, which had to get approved by the Justice Department, there were serious prosecutions of some of these people. And in fact, I think the financial community understands they did not, yes, they did heavily give to the Democratic Party. By the way, more important to them than prosecutions was legislation. They didn't pay for the Volcker Rule. They hate it. They didn't pay for an independent Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So I think the argument that the Democrats were substantially deterred by having had those contributions doesn't hold up empirically. Doesn't mean it had no influence at all, but look at 2008 and look at 2012 and look at the gross difference in the behavior of the financial community and their campaign contributions.
And, okay, one final point, because I agree with you. They didn't pay for you either, and that's an incredibly important thing that explains why they have the regulation they have right now. But don't you believe that the critical thing we need to change is the way we're going to fund elections so that this game that goes on where...
Oh, I've been for public financing for a very long time,
Okay, so
but I
why
would
didn't
not...
you- that's what I wanted you to
But
say.
I would
Can
not
you say that
exaggerate,
that way?
but I don't want you to exaggerate the impact of it, because a greater influence, in my judgment, than the campaign system in the old days was the intellectual current, the academics, the media, et cetera. They have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to say academics are really important in this, but also I think the money is important.
Oh, and let me leave out one other point here, and I want to say this. Politicians, I've been very critical of my fellow politicians, and the media makes me crazy, and the voters are no bargain either.
Okay. The public's no bargain either. For those of you who didn't hear it. All right, Michael?
Congressman Frank, and this very definitely is a question. One of the most unheralded but actually very important provisions of Dodd-Frank related to investment advisors, and what it did was it, as you know, brought in private equity and hedge funds into the SEC supervisory regime over investment advisors. After that happened, the SEC started examining private equity firms, and in a very dramatic way last May, an official of the SEC stood up and said more than half of the firms that we have now audited are effectively stealing from their investors. And this was actually quite a shock to investors in private equity and to private equity managers. And of course, the industry has pushed back very hard against this provision, which is actually more lenient on them than it is for ordinary money managers, because the threshold is $150 million to be in the SEC regime.
I didn't start out with that threshold. That's the most votes.
Well, actually, here's the question, though, which is that in February, you actually spoke at a conference, actually, that was a private equity industry conference, and what was reported, and it was very widely reported in the financial press, this is a report. Barney Frank remarked that during the time of the crisis, Congress erred on the side of being too cautious, and as a result, set the bar too low for requiring private equity firms to register at $150 million. He said that Congress should take a hard look at raising it. So I'm curious whether that is your perspective, and if you'd like to clarify your remarks,
No,
because it really, I think, shook up quite a few people to hear that.
Well, first of all, I don't fully recall that. What I did, part of the issue was it had to do with whether or not they would be, the larger ones would be registered as systemically important. There was a question about the family-owned firms, and I honestly don't remember that, because I may have misspoken. We did start out with a somewhat lower level this is for registration as an advisor?
As an investment advisor.
As an advisor.
So your words are being flogged by the industry.
Yeah, I may have misunderstood the question. I mean, we did want, well, first of all, we did want all the firms to be covered by the regulation. On the advisor issue, I will have to tell you, I just do not remember the specifics. I do know we lost a little bit.
So that's not your opinion today?
Yeah, Michael, we're
Great.
going to have to, ma'am, and we are running low on time. We're not out of time, so
I believe that Malcolm has made this a really central point, and that is that there's been an over-preoccupation with what constitutes criminal activity, and pernicious, avaricious, very damaging behavior has gone on. And it has, and I'm from Canada, and Canada, I can tell you this gave our politicians a pass because they knew they would never face the music because it was not criminal behavior. So if we're not getting them in the criminal courts, how then, Malcolm, do we take these people to task? And should we not be looking at reverting back to first principles and some tort reform and identifying some torts that meet some of this behaviors? Look at some standalone torts.
All right.
I'm going to let the legal redress be addressed by legal scholars. I'm not sure, to what extent changing the tort system will work. Larry, you used to teach torts. You can make a comment on that as well. I have not been focused so much on that particular remedy as to what are the institutional conditions that drive this behavior in the first place. And that I think one of the things that the torts can't get to is the kind of things that I think that Barney and I have been sharing on this, which has to do with the extraordinarily perverse incentives that live, inside the corporations. And these incentives are institutionally supported. There is obviously collusion between the board and the executives, on this because they approve it. So I'm sorry, I apologize, I can't answer the tort question, but I can answer the internal part. And there are some extremely interesting, important, practical, wealth-creating solutions that I think can dampen the kind of corruption that we see.
One sentence that's relevant. First, we did try to make it easier to sue the rating agencies. We got some of these are not as easy as we wanted. Two, we got it through the House, banning the requirement that you go to arbitration with your investment advisor as opposed to being able to sue.
Yeah.
I lost that one in the Senate, but it's still up to the SEC. They could do it if they wanted to.
We have time for a 30-second question and a 30-second answer, sir. So,
I'm interested in Paul Romer's idea, laws and norms, and also thinking about shame and ridicule and how to organize those in ways that can make a difference.
Yeah, I think the change in the law can change norms, but ridicule, shame is part of how we enforce norms, and ridicule is also part of how we enforce the norms. But they can be used both to stop bad behavior and even to move the norms. I think Barney is right that the press plays a very important role in this. I think academics contribute to it, and we're not thoughtful enough about how we contribute to it. But groups like this and the center contribute to changing norms as well.
okay. All right. I am actually going to give the last word to Mal, partly because he was a great colleague and partly because I hope he will then take pity on me at the head of the Charleses fall and let me beat him. So anyway, Mal?
First of all, Greg, thank you for doing this. This has been really helpful and terrific. And to the panel as well. I just want to say one word about Barney. This is the second time that Barney and I have met. The first time that we met was in 1972, was that it? 16 elections ago. 20 elections ago at Steve Cunnion's house on Marlborough Street. I think you were colleagues at law school together. And we were invited for a money raiser. And Barney gave, one of these really dynamic, kind of almost off the wall, fantastically interesting discussions. And of course, it was a money raiser. And I have to tell you, Barney, why I gave money then and why I have given money since. Barney was running for office and he was giving this fiery talk, and he had a pair of unmatched shoes on. And I figured that anybody who could run for office with unmatched shoes on really deserved my vote. It was all substance, substance, substance. So thank you.
I would just say they were match shoes. I just didn't happen to be wearing the ones that.
Okay, well, I think that'll do it for today. Thank all of you for attending.